Castro and the communist government there. It was declassified and can be found online at the JFK Library. Terrifying that no one knows or seems to care that this was suggested by our government to the president. So it's completely feasible that 9/11 was a false flag operation. One U.S. bomber accidentally dropped a nuclear bomb a short distance from a major U.S. city, can't remember which, but luckily it didn't detonate. Off the coast of Georgia. They still haven't found it. No, they know exactly where it is. It would just be more dangerous to retrieve it than to just leave it alone. It's off the coast of Savannah. My hometown was littered with radioactive waste by the federal government as part of the Manhattan Project. I grew up 2 miles from the LOOW, Lake Ontario Ordnance Works, site, and my dad grew up on 89th Street in Niagara Falls in the 40s. He says that he remembers sitting on the train tracks as a kid, watching the Hooker chemical trucks bring in 55-gallon drums to the Love Canal. That whole area was contaminated with all sorts of nasty stuff. So what did they do? They bulldozed it over and built houses on it, of course. Then in the 70s, when people were noticing toxic sludge in their basements, kids' feet were being literally burned by the high levels of phosphorus in the ground and people were getting sick, they acted like they knew nothing. Eventually people sued and the whole area was evacuated. They tried to clean it up, but they basically put tons of dirt and clay over the area as a cap, and it's all fenced off. You can see it when you drive east on the Niagara Falls Expressway to Towanda. For the Lewiston storage site, also known as the NFSS Niagara Falls storage site, I've read documents where they had hazardous storage barrels sitting exposed to the elements, with seepage and all that. Again, they've covered everything with clay to stop it, but it's already in the ground. The bad thing is that there's a large elementary and high school, Lewiston Porter, about 2 miles from the site, which is actually on property that used to be part of the site but was never used and was sold to the county. Needless to say, the cancer rate among long-term staff and teachers is higher than average. I'm glad to have finally moved away. The Department of Health and Human Services practiced female sterilization on Native American women all the way through the 1970s. Kinda sobering knowing that we were using tax dollars to suppress indigenous birth rates less than 50 years ago. I think even recently in Manitoba there's been reports of hospital staff telling local indigenous women, who'd just given birth, that they aren't allowed to see their babies unless they consent to sterilization. First Nations are still incredibly vulnerable, and the West is still feeling aftershocks of genocide. Operation Mockingbird, Operation Northwoods, Operation Paperclip, the fact that we pardoned Unit 731. The list goes on and on. Unit 731 makes Mengele look like a pediatrician with good bedside manner. They were a Japanese experimental group that tested various chemical, biological, and psychological weapons on people, using the most brutal methods possible. Vivisection, amputation, removing vital organs, gas chambers, spinning people in centrifuges until they died, putting people in vacuum chambers until their bodies popped from lack of pressure, bombarding people with radiation until they died. They forced men to rape women to spread syphilis to the population and test the effects on people. They also spread the Black Death in Manchuria through fleas. Raped babies into women to perform experiments on different stages of pregnancies. Burned the corpses of their victims so no accurate number of victims exist. At least 600,000 were infected with plague. The big kicker is all the main leaders of the group were granted complete immunity from post-war tribunes by the US and US alone, in exchange for the information gleaned from their vicious and brutal mad science. It's basically one of the most horrible things from the Second World War and almost no one knows about it. And the US really wants it that way. CIA invested millions in trying to make cat spies. 20 million to be precise. I dunno, the way my friend's cat is staring at me right now, maybe they succeeded. As a part of the Army and CIA's experiments into mind control, they put electrodes into the pleasure centers of dogs' brains. Initially, they wanted hundreds of dogs. They only actually got 10, and of those only a few were implanted. The ones which were would be remote controlled by zapping them and essentially giving them a dose of dopamine when they were facing the right direction. The controllers would stop the dope zap when they wanted the dogs to stop, and then the dogs would reorient themselves until they were facing the correct direction. This meant when the controllers weren't present, the dogs who had been implanted would continually spin in circles, even in their cages, always looking for the direction that gave them that next hit. The program ran out of funding in the mid-60s, and the dogs were destroyed. CIA involvement in starting the Guatemalan Civil War, which lasted 36 years and led to the genocide of hundreds of thousands of indigenous people. Canadian here. The Somalia affair. Not sure if it was ever classified, but definitely a horrific scandal. A now disbanded division of the Canadian military torturing a kid to death in the 90s, and taking hero pics with him while doing it. I think it's important to remember when your country does something crappy. It's not always the bad guys who can be effing evil. Not really terrifying but effed up, Operation Paperclip. Where after World War II the US government took Nazi scientists and shipped them to America to do science. Some of them came straight from Nuremberg cells. The most noteworthy being Wernher von Braun. Von Braun built the V-2 rockets with Jewish slave labor. Every day they would execute the 5 slowest workers in front of the other workers to incentive them to work harder. Once he came to America, we shipped him to Huntsville, Alabama, where he built the Saturn V, the rocket used in the Apollo program, and got us to the moon. It's not a declassified document, but a friend of mine that served in Desert Storm told me some things. Every morning during muster their group was given a small pill to take, supposedly to protect them from the toxins the Iranians were releasing into the air. My friend thought it was odd and he never swallowed his pill, just as some other members of their group didn't. Years go by, and all of the people that he still talks to that took the pill have cancer of various types as well as a plethora of other medical issues. The ones that did not take the pill seemingly have nothing wrong with them other than normal effects of being middle-aged. Some crazy stuff, and often the military enlisted become guinea pigs for the government without their knowledge or consent. Operation Mockingbird, where it was found the CIA employed about 400 top journalists in the 1960s to put out propaganda. They were caught, but it never stopped. LOL, the most terrifying one isn't anywhere near the top. The Snowden files. The US government mass surveillance projects. Capitalize mass because they are collecting upwards of 50 to 75% of all communication in the US. That is an incredible violation of our right to decline unwarranted search and seizure. Not declassified but rather leaked by a man named Gary Webb, who committed suicide by shooting himself in the back of the head twice with a shotgun, wrote a book called The Dark Side detailing how the CIA smuggled crack into inner cities to be distributed among lower-class, black, neighborhoods. Dyatlov Pass. That's some of the freakiest crap ever. Basically, a group of college kids went on a hiking trip in Siberia. They don't return and a rescue party went out to find them. They found the bodies scattered around with various injuries. One was found with their eyes enclosed. None of them were clothed. They were just wearing underwear and temperatures so cold skin exposure could lead to instant frostbite. Their clothes were found neatly packed up in their campsite along with their stove and the rest of their supplies. Radiation was found on their clothes as well. The tents appeared to have been cut open from the inside. When the time came for their funeral, the USSR tried to cover up their deaths, even tearing down pamphlets about the funeral on the college campus where they were living before they died. Freaky stuff. Edit. What I personally think happened is that the hikers witnessed a Soviet weapons test and then they were killed by the military because they weren't supposed to witness it. But there are plenty of theories. The complete effing madness that was Chernobyl. The only man who survived being in the power plant had to have every bit of skin replaced. He can't touch gasoline. People basically melting from the inside. Concrete walls turned to liquid, people vaporized in the initial explosion. Firefighters falling to their knees and vomiting their literal guts up, complete madness. CIA document on how Hitler did not die after the war, but escaped to South America where he lived out the rest of his life. Not technically declassified, but the leaked Panama Papers revealed a global network of billionaires and politicians conspiring to launder money and evade taxes. The surprisingly terrifying part is that by and large they got away with it. I think in the US one person has been indicted. One. Not sure when/if it was considered declassified, but the Brits' bioweapons program during the Cold War was pretty extensive. Gruinard Island off the coast of Scotland was a major testing ground where they blister bomb anthrax on sheep and then watch them melt basically. When they tested the soil years later, They found 1 gram still contained tens of thousands of anthrax spores. Government then dumped around 300 tons of formaldehyde on the island to decontaminate. Apparently it's okay now. During Prohibition in the US, the government wanted to prevent people from making moonshine out of ethanol, so they just low-key added poison to ethanol supplies. An estimated 10,000 people died as a result. If the government did an advertising campaign informing people of this, it wasn't good enough. The Rendlesham Forest Incident. A nuclear arms silo based in the UK, top secret security clearances, and they have a UFO come and disable their missile system at the height of the Cold War and possible missile exchanges. Well documented. The one guy's account is so effing scary. Lost a bunch of time, then suddenly develops a heart murmur and scarring on his heart and internal organs that wasn't there previously. So a few people mentioned weaponry being declassified, but there is one that is still classified that we know a bit of info about. Project Sundial. This is a nuclear design with a potential 10 gigaton yield. So large that the US military initially turned down the idea and called it a doomsday device. The designer said, paraphrasing, "This is a bomb you never have to use. Just leave it sitting in your backyard and nobody will bother you." It's so powerful the military turned down the design because it had no strategic use. Another quote. "It would have been a better world without Teller." The Broken Arrow incidents. Basically, the US lost 32 nuclear bombs during the Cold War, and none of them have been found to this day. The UK government's Operation Legacy, in which they systematically destroyed evidence of atrocities they had committed over the years of the British Empire. For example, it isn't really a known fact that the UK had concentration camps in Kenya, where they routinely castrated, raped and massacred people. The government didn't want the former colonies to get hold of the files, so shredded, burned and buried them at sea. Operation Sea Spray is a fun one. In 1950, the US Navy sprayed a cloud of bacteria over San Francisco in a biological warfare experiment under Operation Sea Spray, just to see what happened. 11 patients at a local hospital developed very rare serious infections, and it led to the death of 1 patient. Cases of pneumonia also increased in San Francisco after the experiment. The CIA involvement in the Indonesian mass killings of 1965 to 1966. There was a coup claiming to counter a planned military coup and protect the president. It failed after killing 6 senior military officers, and the president was put under house arrest and the military took over in a counter coup. The Communist Party was claimed and purged. 500,000 to 3 million civilians died, and the CIA gladly supplied arms and a list of suspect communists to kill. This killed any leftist political movements in Indonesia, and the left is still dead there today. It is still illegal to be an atheist or a communist today. You must be one of the 6 official religions, and it is printed on your ID card. Quite literally, no one knows of one of the largest political massacres in history. The Pentagon Papers highlighted that the US military leadership provoked and lied inter-armed conflict with North Vietnam, and also knew that the war was unwinnable. 58,000 US servicemen died in the conflict, many of them serving against their will. Not necessarily declassified, but that in 1921 the United States Army actually flew airplanes over and bombed Tulsa, Oklahoma, in an area come to be known as Black Wall Street. It was a place where blacks flourished, doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs. So a race riot was started, and they literally killed hundreds of blacks and destroyed thousands of homes and businesses. Factor IV. A medicine for hemophiliacs was infected with AIDS and sent overseas to sell to save Bayer from losing money. MKUltra. The CIA's own mind control program. The fact that people were subjected to hallucinogens and other chemicals, endured physical, sexual and mental torture at the hands of a government agency is disturbing. Also, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. A fabricated attack on U.S. ships for an excuse to escalate the Vietnam conflict. Area 51 was never publicly acknowledged by the U.S. government until around the 2010s, if I recall correctly. The reason was because many contractors who had worked there had inhaled fumes, lead paint and other classified materials, or disposed in a trench on site and routinely burned, where the fumes could be inhaled, and were dying. All they wanted to know was what fumes they had inhaled so their doctors could save them. The answer they ultimately got was essentially, "Okay, yes, This place exists, we used to make reconnaissance aircraft there, but you're not allowed to know what it is that's killing you. None of the contractors survived, but because of their lawsuit, the government finally acknowledged Area 51. The Tuskegee syphilis experiments were pretty awful. Lasting from 1932 to 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service injected thousands of African Americans with syphilis under the guise of free health care for clinical studies. They were also encouraged to have sex with as many people as possible in order to see the effects of syphilis as it passes through patients. Not so much government documents but the Catholic Church and the history of priests abusing children and nuns, while the higher-ups looked the other way. Not in one local church or city, but all over the world. We knew Pearl Harbor was going to happen. We warned no civilians, we left sailors in harm's way on purpose to get involved in World War II. That is also why the aircraft carriers were out on maneuvers at the time. Operation Midnight Climax. The government hired sex workers to dose Johns with LSD for research purposes, so to speak. There are over 50 mishaps with nuclear weapons by the U.S. Air Force in the 1950s alone. In East Germany, a committed freedom fighter and her husband had dealt with having her home raided while she was away, being arrested on the way to protests and all sorts of state-sponsored harassment. After the wall fell, she was able to read the documents the Stasi had kept on her, and found out her own husband was an undercover agent and had written many reports on her activities with a bloodless banality. British Metropolitan Police Services have done exactly the same on ecological protesters from organizations like Greenpeace. There was literally a case a few years back, like 5 years ago, an undercover cop I believe married, and even had kids with a protester he was investigating the whole way through. What is the creepiest disappearance case that you know about? In about 1971, a lady in Boca Raton reported her daughter missing. Her boyfriend was also missing along with his van. At some point over the years, she hired private detectives to look for the two. At one point she was told they were living in San Francisco. She was once told her daughter had a child. She never could understand why her daughter broke off contact and continued to look for her daughter. Along the streets in South Florida there are usually drainage canals that drain the Everglades to the ocean. Some are quite deep. In about 2000 they dredged a canal not far from her house and found the van. Daughter and boyfriend were both inside. All those years they were just down the street. At least she had closure. Brandon Lawson. He ran out of gas on the highway in the middle of the night and called his brother to come help him. Shortly after he called 911 and reported that someone had chased him into the woods and that he needed police. Eventually his brother and one police officer arrive at the scene and find his truck abandoned but no sign of Brandon. Brandon calls his brother and says he's bleeding and is 10 minutes away from his truck. That was the last anyone ever heard from him, and searches of the area turned up empty. The Jamison family. The Jamison family, 2 adults, 1 young daughter, was interested in purchasing a plot of land in Oklahoma. They drive out in their pickup truck to check it out. Truck is later found abandoned. $32,000 cash found in truck, along with the Jamisons' IDs, wallets, mobile phones, and a GPS. The family dog was also left in the truck, and was extremely malnourished. A camera is discovered. The final picture was of their daughter, 6-year-old Madison, who looks somewhat distressed. Security footage is uncovered, with the family appearing trance-like and not speaking to one another. The Jamison skeletal remains are found years later, dumped less than 3 miles from where the pickup truck was originally discovered. Remains show no signs of struggle. I remember reading about the disappearance of Susan Powell in a similar one of these threads a few months back. It's a wild story. Husband and wife, with 2 young sons, have a bad marriage. He's abusive and controlling, and at one point they had to move because the husband's father was in love with the wife. Things get so bad she starts fearing for her life, then one night the whole family disappears, only to have the husband come back a few days later saying that he and the boys went camping and he had no idea where the wife was. As the investigation into what happened to the wife goes on, the husband acts more and more suspiciously, eventually moving with the kids to live with his father that they moved away from in the first place, but then lost custody of the kids because the father got caught with a bunch of child porn, and hundreds of creeper shots of Susan. Finally, during a supervised visit, the husband grabs his sons from the social worker, holes himself up inside his house and then blows it up, killing himself and both the boys. And all the while, they never solved the mystery of what happened to Susan Powell, and she is still listed as missing, although presumed murdered and dumped somewhere by the husband. It's a sad, crazy tale. One of the boys told the police that mom was camping with them or something about mommy being in the trunk. The Sodder children disappearance. On Christmas Eve, December 24, 1945, a fire destroyed the Sodder home in Fayetteville, West Virginia. At the time, it was occupied by George Sodder, his wife Jenny, and 9 of their 10 children. During the fire, George, Jenny, and 4 of the 9 children escaped. The bodies of the other 5 children had never been found. The fire was blamed on faulty wiring. However, one of the jurors involved in the inquest had, at one point, threatened George Sodder, saying his house would be burned and his children destroyed. The Sodders continued to question the official findings about the fire. They wondered why, if it had been caused by an electrical problem, the family's Christmas lights had remained on throughout the fire's early stages, when the power should have gone out. A telephone repairman told the Sodders that the house's phone line had not been burned through in the fire, as they had initially thought, but cut by someone who had been willing and able to climb 14 feet up the pole. A missing ladder belonging to the Sodders was found at the bottom of an embankment soon after the incident. A man whom neighbors had seen stealing a block and tackle from the property around the time of the fire was identified and arrested. He admitted to the theft, and claimed he had been the one who cut the phone line, thinking it was a power line, but denied having anything to do with the fire. However, no record identifying him exists, and why he would have wanted to cut any utility lines to the Sodder house while stealing the block and tackle has never been explained. Jenny Sodder also had trouble accepting Morris's belief that all traces of the children's bodies had been burned completely in the fire. Many of the household appliances had been found, still recognizable, in the ash. A local crematorium supported her theory. The truck's failure to start was also considered. George Sodder believed they had been tampered with, perhaps by the same man who stole the block and tackle and cut the phone line. The only bone fragments ever found on the site were a few human vertebrae fragments, although these were confirmed to have never been exposed to fire. The part where they got a letter from early decades later with a photo of a young man who would be about Louis' age that said Louis Sodder, "I love brother Frankie. Elio boys." A9013 makes it even weirder. The PI they hired to investigate the note seemed to vanish as well. Dorothy Jane Scott, young divorced mom working at a head shop. One day at a meeting, a coworker falls ill, so Dorothy and another coworker take him to the hospital. It is found that he has a black widow bite. Following his treatment, Dorothy goes to get the car. When the co-workers make it outside, they see Dorothy's car speeding towards them. She doesn't stop, and that is the last time anyone sees her. The next day her car is found torched, but she is nowhere to be found. Over the next few years her parents start receiving taunting phone calls. Calls asking if Dorothy is home, a call claiming to know where she is, and so on. 4 years later, a construction worker finds trapped bones next to a highway. Upon forensic investigation, it is learned that they are canine bones and the bones of Dorothy Jane Scott. It is deducted that they have been there for 2 years. Angela Hammond. While driving home, Angela Hammond stops at a phone booth to call her fiancé Rob and describes a creepy-looking man in a pickup truck in the parking lot. Her fiancé suddenly hears Angela scream and drives into town to check on her. He passes by a pickup truck and sees Angela struggling with an unidentified man, but after attempting a pursuit, the transmission on his truck gives out, and this is the last anyone ever sees of Angela. She still hasn't been found and went missing in 1991. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. I can't wrap my head around how at the same time practically anything we do is monitored, recorded and stored, but we somehow still manage to lose a whole effing passenger aircraft. Amy Bradley. She was on a cruise with her family. She was last seen asleep on the balcony of the cabin and was seen earlier in the night with the band on the cruise. She was reported missing shortly after the cruise docked. There was no signs of her on the ship or in the ocean. There were possible sightings of Bradley in Curacao in 1998 and 1999. Two Canadian tourists reported seeing a woman resembling Amy on a beach in Curacao in August 1998. The woman's tattoos were reportedly identical to Bradley's. Bradley's tattoos included a Tasmanian devil spinning a basketball located on her shoulder, the sun placed on her lower back, a Chinese symbol located on her right ankle, and a gecko lizard on her navel. She also had a naval ring. A member of the Navy stated that he saw Bradley in a brothel in 1999. He claimed she told him that her name was Amy Bradley and she begged him for help, explaining that she was not allowed to leave. I find it freaky just because of how terrifying human trafficking is. Rico Harris. He was a massive 6 feet 9 inches former Harlem Globetrotter basketball player who had drug issues earlier in his life, but had made a full recovery and was getting his life back on track. He was driving along California's Interstate 5, from his home in Southern California to Seattle, to live with his girlfriend. He was somewhere just north of Sacramento, exhausted, and told his girlfriend over the phone that he wanted to check out the mountains. All calls stopped since then. His car was found a couple days later by a patrolman near a rest stop in the mountains. A massive search was launched. No signs of him. The strangest part. A driver later reported seeing a massive 6 feet 9 inches individual wandering down the highway, just a mile from where the car was found. A search was relaunched. Massive size 17-foot holes were found on the ground that were not there before. They were getting very close, and then nothing. No trace, no body, nothing. Where did Rico go the first time he disappeared? Where was he for an entire week? And where did he disappear to again? The fact that someone could disappear twice is what makes this so darn mystifying to me. The 43 missing students from Mexico. I mean, singles get lost all the time, but effing 43 people are hard to lose, you might think. They found a mass grave with 28 bodies believed to be theirs, but after DNA testing none of those bodies matched with the 43's. Whoa, I think it's creepy that 28 people disappeared and no one seemed to notice. I'm sure there are stranger cases, but this one always creeped me out because I knew the guy. He and I were never friends but ran in the same circles and had a lot of mutual friends. One night he was hanging out at my buddy's place playing video games and left around 9:30 p.m. or 10 p.m. to head back to his apartment. His place was only 3 blocks away, but his keycard was swiped at the wrong building, identical towers next to each other, and he tried to make a phone call to a friend that only lasted 2 seconds but ended before our friend picked up. That was the last sign of where he was. When he didn't show up for classes the next day, our friends started putting out flyers. A few days later his family reported him missing, resulting in a massive search for him with helicopters, dogs, people walking all the fields near campus, the works. Not a trace was found, although it didn't help that it was snowing. Of course the police treated our mutual friend as a suspect as he was the last person to see him. He's the nicest guy, no one who knew him suspected him for a moment, and also said maybe he was drunk and fell in the river or something, but they weren't drinking that much by a long shot, so that didn't make sense. Months later his body is found in an old abandoned barn owned by the school about a mile off campus. Apparently he was curled up behind some equipment in the basement with his shoes at the top of the stairs. The cop's story is that he was out taking photos, got lost, fell down the stairs and died of hypothermia. They attributed the shoes to paradoxical undressing or him literally falling out of his shoes. Except that doesn't make any sense. According to my buddy he was hanging out with, he didn't have his camera on him. There's no mention of it in the police reports, and no sign that he ever made it back to his apartment to get his camera. Would have shown up on keycard records. In addition to that, you could see his apartment tower from the building he was found in, so being lost doesn't make much sense, and his body was already desiccated and partially decomposed when they found it, so I'm not sure how they knew hypothermia was the cause of death. He was also found to have cuts on his hands, and the room he was found in had been locked. The police claim that when he fell down the stairs he hit the door hard enough to unlock and open it, and cut his hands on the doors. Somehow. Personally I think he was murdered. Edit. This is John Lachina from Iowa State I'm talking about, in case you want to look it up. Edit 2. U/Magoo909 reminded me that a couple and one police officer actually searched that building a few weeks before his body was found and didn't see him, so either 3 people searched the building without noticing his shoes, the broken door and his body, or it was moved there later. The disappearance of Bobby Dunbar. In 1912 his parents took him fishing on a lake in Louisiana and he went missing. Police searched for him for 8 months, and finally found a man named William Cantwell Walters who was traveling with a boy that resembled Bobby Dunbar. Walters claimed the boy was the son of a friend who had given him custody, and that the child's name was Bruce Anderson, not Bobby Dunbar. Investigators and positive ID from the parents determined this was actually the Dunbar's child and gave custody over to them. The town had a parade for Bobby Dunbar's return. During the trial with the Dunbars and Walters, a woman named Julia Anderson came to defend Walters, asserting this was her son Bruce and she had given Walters custody. The courts dismissed her because she had 3 children out of wedlock. It was 1912, and 2 were already deceased. The trial being in Mississippi, and her being a very poor woman from North Carolina, she gave up on fighting the case. Then, 9 years ago in 2008, one of Bobby Dunbar's granddaughters had a DNA test done. She compared her grandfather's DNA to his own brother's. They were not related. Really late to the party, and not the creepiest. But definitely creepy. A kid in my high school disappeared after a heavy night of snow. Since he had to walk home every day, about 5 miles, police thought that he had gotten lost in one of the fields he crossed. Since the snow was almost a foot deep on some of these fields, there was nothing they could do except wait for the snow to clear. I believe there were some people who tried searching the fields. But by the time they cleared out one area, it was starting to fill back up with snow. And I also believe the landowners didn't want them in the fields without the police. So, come January, the snow had mostly cleared and police started looking again. Pretty quickly they found almost all of the kid's clothing apart from his shoes and his backpack. So now they were certain he was dead. Nobody could survive in the cold, especially in the middle of a field with nothing for 2 miles around him. Fast forward a year and it's starting to snow again. Not as heavy as the year before, but still 2 to 3 inches deep. A girl walking her dog, or more accurately the dog itself, found a pair of boots with human feet in them poking out of the snow. No connections were really made until a backpack was found nearby by the police, which contained all the boy's possessions. DNA from what was left of the feet found that it was indeed the boy who went missing. A DNA test proved that it was the boy. And what's even stranger is, his left foot was cut clean with a blade. And his right was mangled and chewed. As if it had been bitten/chewed off. I'm personally perplexed by the disappearance of a Japanese woman named Mayumi Arashi. The 27-year-old left her house stating that she was going to meet a certain classmate of hers and never returned. Her older sister, Yoko, later checked with this classmate, who stated that such a meeting was never promised, and thus never happened. Her whole family started searching for her, but to no avail. There was an investigation which pinned a guy called A as the prime suspect. This was due to another note that Mayumi left, stating how she had been betrayed and was sorry. In addition, Yoko stated that she had received a call from A who claimed to have met Mayumi that afternoon she disappeared, and wanted to be in jail if Mayumi ever turns up dead. The day after Mayumi's disappearance, police tailed A and found him entering a mountain or a foresty place or something, carrying 2 cans of juice. The police then lost track of him. Now, it would seem like Mayumi's family, especially her sister Yoko, were extremely cooperative in helping the police, and that A was the prime suspect. This case blew up over the internet after an interview with the father. A news station went to interview the family over this case, and upon interviewing the father, many internet users spotted a mysterious note posted on a wall behind him that the news crew failed to catch. The note, in Mayumi's handwriting, said, "Don't trust what Yoko says." What was the creepiest or most paranormal thing that's ever happened to you? Creepy for me, I was having a tense conversation with someone that I was close to years ago. The conversation quickly devolved into a passive-aggressive fight that ended with the other person getting in the car and driving away. As I started heading back inside, the other person came back, got out of the car, and started our conversation again. The tone of voice was totally different and the stance was different and the feeling in the air was completely off. I don't know how else to explain it. As the conversation progressed, the other person started saying some nasty and mean things that were completely out of character. I said, "This isn't like you, person." They said, "What makes you think that I'm person?" I remember continuing the conversation and talking to the person for a long time, but I don't remember anything specific. I do remember becoming more and more alarmed and knowing something wasn't right. Finally, I told the person to go home. They complied and left. I went back inside and started telling my sibling about the situation when the doorbell rang. Maybe 2 to 3 minutes had passed. It was the person coming back to apologize for the original fight. They had been driving around town for a long time and didn't want to go home, leaving things unresolved. I asked why they had said some of the things from the last conversation and they looked at me like I was crazy. They had no idea what I was talking about. Totally could have been lying, but that whole situation just felt dark. Scared the hell out of me. I was a manager of computer repair for a retailer a couple years ago. We had a client's computer in the back running various malware and virus scans. I was doing morning paperwork in the back near the computer. This PC had its screensaver on, displaying random photos from the My Pictures folder, various family members, children's birthday parties, the usual stuff. Then from then of my eye, I swear to God, I saw a picture of a woman from the shoulders up with her throat cut. As soon as I realized what I was making out, I directed my full attention and it was back to photos of a car show. As the day went on, I thought nothing of it and continued my work until I was bringing another customer's PC to the back to work on, and again from my peripheral I could have sworn I saw a bloody body and bound in a trunk of a car. At that moment I began to freak out. I grabbed one of my employees, explained to him the situation. We then sat for 10 minutes and watched this screensaver. It is against company policy to search through the client's personal files without absolute just cause. We then proceeded to see a photo, 2 bodies in a shallow grave out in the woods, and another photo of a severed hand down in kitchen drawer. I then went and got the general manager and informed him of the situation and had him view this screensaver. We then felt that it would be in everyone's best interest to contact law enforcement. In about 15 minutes later, owner of the computer and another gentleman show up. I proceed to tell him that his computer is not ready and it will be a while. He then informs me that he was called there because someone reported there was some photographs of a grisly murder that we had found. I showed him his computer and then his partner then begins to laugh at him. Apparently he went against police policy and took some of his work home with him and had never noticed his work photos were being used as a screensaver. TLDR, a detective unknowingly brings me his computer filled with gory homicide pictures that get mixed in with his screensaver. I soil myself thinking I am dealing with a murder, call the cops, and the detective returns to investigate his own computer. I was living with my now mother-in-law in a house she had just purchased a few months before. We had all had various weird feelings or experiences in the house, but two really